District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program.
This episode is brought to you by Experian. Are you paying for subscriptions you don't use, but can't find the time or energy to cancel them? Experian could cancel unwanted subscriptions for you, saving you an average of $270 per year and plenty of time. Download the Experian app. Results will vary. Not all subscriptions are eligible. Savings are not guaranteed. Paid membership with connected payment account required.
Welcome to District of Conservation. I am your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Welcome to a short and sweet Earth Day National Park Week themed episode. Tomorrow we're going to dive deep into some very obtuse rulemaking that was finalized across all the different energy, interior, EPA agencies. But today we're going to keep things lighthearted, and I'm going to share some thoughts on these two occasions. So last week, for listeners, you guys can know more specifically what I was up to. I was filming the first 2024 installment of Conservation Nation, and we specifically focused on hydroelectric dams, the trade-offs to removing them, and that discussion over there, because that is probably going to be coming up again, especially in wake of the Klamath Dam removal efforts and the shoddy removal efforts that have been underway there. We had Nick Pope from Daily Caller, and the implications from that don't look to be good for dam breaching proponents. And slightly different situation in Klamath versus the lower Snake River. Klamath is a privately run dam. Snake River, the lower Snake River, the four dams in particular, are overseen by the Army Corps of Engineers. And we went to a lot of places because we're not just going to a specific region. We try to make it like a blog format, inviting people into the region that we're exploring and investigating. And that leads me to today's National Park Week and Earth Week discussion. I got a head start on National Park Week going to Mount Rainier National Park, and Mount Rainier has kind of been on my mind of a place to visit for a long time. And if you don't know, there are 63 specific national parks in the United States, or official national parks is what I should say. Then there are over 400 some odd National Park Service related sites, including battlefields, historic monuments, etc. But there are only 63 of the official national parks, what you can consider a national park. And there have been some new ones added to the mix in recent years. I believe White Sands is one of the more recent additions, and also Indiana Great Dunes, I believe, was also an addition recently within the last few years. I'm not sure what's going to be in the docket soon, but right now, as of this recording, there are 63. And Mount Rainier is actually one of the older ones. It was designated a national park in March 1899 under President William McKinley, signing a bill into law to authorize the creation of Mount Rainier. And Mount Rainier is actually our country's 5th national park. And it was created from a national forest, the first of its kind. And others are created usually from BLM or other public lands, but apparently it was the first to be created under the Forest Service. And Mount Rainier, you can see Mount Rainier all over Seattle and much of Washington as you're driving around, and you can't miss it because it's a stratovolcano measuring about 14,411 feet. And let me tell you, the place is magnificent. Like, whether you're viewing it from Cary Park in Seattle in downtown Washington, as I did, you could see it on a clear day. We could see it from the airport. You can see it from the actual base of it yourself when you go to the park. And I went to the Henry Jackson Memorial Visitor Center, and it was largely open. The roads were clear. I didn't have to worry about chain tires. That was something that was kind of on my mind if I had adequate chain tires, but the roads were clear. I had 4-wheel drive tires, and my rental car service Enterprise doesn't offer snow chain tires. So it was going to be fine regardless. And one of the places, the trails I wanted to hike, I was uncertain about whether or not it was clear to hike or easy to traverse. So we just stayed at the base of the mountain, Mount Rainier itself, and we saw people snowshoeing and cross-country skiing And it was really nice just to see people out. And it was really bright. If you guys don't know, sometimes wintry conditions are very misleading where it looks cold, but it actually is really bright. And I'm not sure what explains that scientifically, but it was kind of blinding. And so I had to put on my sunglasses, even though it was like 42 degrees. It didn't feel cold, which was really nice. And even with my short time in Mount Rainier, I really enjoyed it. It's going to be part of the video. And I got to check off my 14th of 63 national parks. So that was super exciting. But if you find yourself near a official national park or a National Park Service site this week, I believe there are some discounts and some free entry days. I know this past Saturday they were advertising it for Mount Rainier, but there should be some awesome perks to it. And you can get a National Park Service pass, which covers all public lands. It's a bargain. It's worth the 80 some odd dollars for traversing all national parks, BLM lands, and others. You'll save a ton of money. And I've done some reviews on that too. But this year I'm not traveling to national parks as much because I have other trips that are non-national park related, which I will go into as those trips come, if they have any tie into conservation. But National Park Week, I'm a big fan of our national parks. Like I said, I loved visiting Mount Rainier, even with the snow still remaining there and before the rush. I think this year Mount Rainier is instituting its first timed entry system. And I have mixed feelings about that, dear listeners. And I've talked about this before, and I don't think you should create obstacles for access. And I found actually the timed entry didn't really lessen my time to traverse and explore Arches National Park and a few other Utah places. The lines were still long. I didn't really see any difference. And, limiting parks, not really a grand idea, especially if you're appropriated as an agency billions of dollars to fix infrastructure, maintenance backlog, and then now you want to also make it entirely cashless and also, institute these timed entry fees. I understand for crowd control. Okay, yes, a lot of people visit, great. But if it's exploited as a means to limit access, I've made this argument before, I don't like that. And I think I use credit cards, great, it's easy. But some people still use cash. I think that's a wrong-headed position. So I love the national parks. I don't want them to be privatized. But I have some problems with current management practices and why we're not seeing, a boost to infrastructure. Why are we seeing these prohibitions or incremental kind of restrictions that don't seem to be, an attack on public lands access, but we do, in the grand scheme of things, kind of see that it could lead to a diminishment of park access and park visitation. We don't want that. We want more people to visit the parks because it's estimated there's going to be over 300 million visits to all the national parks, according to National Geographic. We want everyone to enjoy. And also, you shouldn't have to worry as well. We're going to dive deep into this more about you getting penalized for taking video on your social media and potentially being considered engaging in commercial filming activities. That is something you also have to be aware of, not necessarily alarmed by, but there is some pending court cases and maybe some potential rules. One of the few good rules from this administration to clarify what a commercial project is, so your social media postings will not be considered such. So go find your park, visit a national park, official one, or one of the 400 some odd different sites. I'm not compensated to say this. I just like the national parks. I got an early love of this when I used to go to the national parks with my parents. Great place. It's better than Disneyland. So go and enjoy the great outdoors this week and take advantage of deals as it relates to National Park Week. And today happens to be April 22nd, which is when Earth Day is annually held. I have partaken in some Earth Day cleanups in my high school years, and I was in the OC Register in the community I was living in with my sister and a former friend at the time, doing some cleanups in some of the parks in the area. And I like the principle. I believe Earth Day has sadly strayed from its true conservationist roots, if you could even consider it had true conservation roots. And it had some very questionable origins with one of the founders composting his girlfriend. That's a really ugly side to Earth Day, and people don't know that. So I'm of the mindset that Earth Day kind of needs to be repackaged, remade, reimagined. I hate that term reimagined, but in this case, I think it's appropriate. But I want to reimagine Earth Day as something that is more true conservationist, not kind of this alarmist version of environmentalism or what I call status quo environmentalism, which has tinges of rewilding or radical preservation, which have been touted as conservation and lumped together with conservation, but they're not. If you look to see what's happening at the federal level, regulation-wise, we're not really seeing conservation demonstrated and exuded as a practice. We're seeing people restricted on public lands, recreationally and for commercial purposes. We see gradual prohibitions on what types of products, lead products, you can use to go fishing and hunting. That's seen as an attack on public lands too. We've seen 60 million acres closed off to hunting in Alaska. Potentially some more is afoot. We've also seen these declarations from the United Nations that we only have 2 years left until total calamity ensues with respect to the planet. But I want to remind you, as I wrote at IWF today in a piece I called Let's Retake Earth Day from Radical Environmentalists, I really wanted to paint a positive vision of what Earth Day should truly look like. And I hope I accomplished that with this post. But I pointed out several things, positive things actually, that are occurring. So everyone talks about doom and gloom, and continued use of fossil fuels have made the environment far worse. We're also seeing this rhetoric that you have to forego living first world luxury comforts. You have to abandon meat eating. You can't use your gas-powered cars. And what type of message are environmentalists, preservationists sending with this abandonment, sacrificial message that they themselves will not adhere to? You don't see these people abandoning air travel. You don't see them abandoning meat consumption. You don't see them abandoning use of gas-guzzling cars. So why should we have to do that? And why is it viewed that if you engage in these activities, you're worsening the environment, despite all the evidence showing that we actually, with continued use of, let's say, carbon-intensive goods and services, we do have a lot better environmental standards. We have more wildlife. We have cleaner air, cleaner water, because the two are not at odds with one another. Having environmental stewardship and economic productivity, two ideas that have been pitted against one another, even though they're not mutually exclusive, they can work in concert with one another. But we still have people pitting the two against one another, claiming that if nature is put over the economy or people's well-being, you're going to inspire people to care about nature. And as we've seen before, when you have these dictates and mandates, you don't see people supporting, let's say, measures to fight environmental problems or getting them animated about fighting climate change. And climate change as a priority, you look at all the polls, electorally speaking, it's a low priority. In fact, I would argue that the push for net zero is turning off a lot of people. People are seeing environmental social governance posturing in their gasoline, heating, home utility prices because of this insistence on going net zero. So when people see that fighting climate change or charting on a net zero course is going to be eating at your electricity bill, leading to higher food prices, energy prices, when you move away from carbon intensive goods or so-called carbon intensive goods and services, you see a diminishing support for such policies. And I could point you to so many examples. I think I list some in this blog post, but I want to hone in on some positive news here. So Vox reports that the earth is literally greener. There's a greening effect, even though there are claims of rampant deforestation. There's actually evidence showing that deforestation is a lot less common now, which is good. You see that climate-related deaths are down 98%. And if we are supposedly in a biodiversity crisis, why are they writing time and time again across different news outlets that 18,000 new species are discovered annually? But then you have this contrasted with a message that Mother Earth is dying and we are engaging in perpetuating a climate crisis. And I argue that this is not conservation in my blog post and anytime I do these kind of musings, because conservation is a wise use of natural resources. That could mean wildlife management. That could be a little grazing, a little bit of energy development, what have you. But what they do here is they lump conservation with this preservationist notion that says you have to go net zero, that you have to be an extreme preservationist, and that humans are irredeemable despoilers of the natural world. I argued in this piece that that thinking is outdated, toxic, and unsustainable. And as a true conservationist, and I'm not alone, that this type of gaslighting is something that shouldn't be tolerated. And I think that we should reclaim this from radicals. And so I go on to say that all this rulemaking that tells you you have to change your lifestyle is not amenable to a true conservationist lifestyle. You can have these luxuries and comforts, and you can still care about the environment. Like I said earlier, if you take away people's comfort, they are less likely and less inclined to support environmentalism or environmental policies. And you see this happening time and time again. There's a distrust, a healthy distrust, mind you, in the different federal agencies. And when you put all these dictates, coming from the BLM, EPA, DOI in general, DOE, you see people saying, I don't trust the federal government, and you shouldn't trust the federal government to be a partner in conservation. And this is what happens when you have top-down policies and you see a distrust among, let's say, BLM and Western stakeholders, and it breeds sometimes into extremism. That's what happens when you have preservation, rewilding at the forefront when it's masqueraded as conservation. And then they say, well, we're conservationists. Then you have people being labeled as anti-conservationists. And it's mind-numbingly stupid that this is what is viewed as conservation, even though it's not. When you have top-down policies, when you have net zero, when you have all these demands and this posturing, rather, that is not conservationist in nature whatsoever. And you're putting one so-called interest above others. You're putting nature above people and economic development, sustainable economic development, and then ultimately nature and people are worse off. That's why I do these conservationist conservative lectures. That's why I write for different publications, whether it's my column at Town Hall or the various writings I do as Independent Women's Forum's Center for Energy and Conservation Director, or posting things here on the podcast trying to demystify what actual conservation is and retake that term from people who are actually despoiling the term, if we're being honest. Preservationists who are despoiling the term, rewilders who are misconstruing and truly bastardizing what the term means. So we have to take this holiday back, much like conservation, from those who seek to undermine it and mislead on what it actually is. So if you want to read the piece for yourself, I encourage you to do so. Everything is in the show notes, but I want to wish you a happy National Park Week, happy Earth Day, even though some of the origins are kind of suspect and a little crazy to begin with. So I think there's an opportunity for conservatives or conservationists, or both of us, conservative conservationists, if you're one like me, to really kind of reflect on this holiday and argue why the system we have in place in America, when you unleash innovation, when you allow for property rights, and when you allow for multiple use sustained yield management of public lands, wonderful things can happen. But we're seeing conservation policies go in the negative direction with all this rulemaking and pitting people against nature. Not healthy, not conducive to true conservation. And I've argued this before. I'm going to argue it again. We got to pivot in a positive direction. And what we're seeing now is not positive nor conservation minded. So I hope that is something you take away from today's discussion. Thanks for listening to District of Conservation. If you enjoyed what you heard today, go leave us some reviews on Apple and Spotify or wherever podcasts are played. Your feedback will help us reach more people, and I love to know what is on your mind after each episode. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat or a guest announcement, because that is our way of updating all of you listeners, and we have just hit 1,000 followers on Instagram for the podcast account. Thank you very much. And if you have any guest suggestions or topics you want to hear on the show, I am all ears. I would love to hear your feedback there. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode.